Welcome to week 2 of our eBusiness course. In this video, we're going to spend a little time setting a foundation of some shared definitions about eBusiness, as well as talking about the conversion funnel, which is an important concept to any eBusiness discussion. So one of the things we should know is that this idea of looking for something and then saying, I want this delivered to my house, is not new at all. It's been around for well over a century. In fact, a company that you may have heard of and you think of as very non-innovative and a relic of the past would be an example of that. Sears. For decades, the Sears wish book was a print catalog that came to our house. And just like we browse through the pages of the web, we browse through the pages of this holiday catalog, circling the things that we wished for Christmas. That's right. Kids around the country waited to see this book every fall and used it as a mechanism to let Santa, their parents, know what they would like for Christmas. And magically, once they made that determination, and if their parents agreed, their parents could then contact Sears, much like we put something in our shopping cart on an online store, and have that product delivered to us at our home. Sometimes it was delivered to a store, but that sounds much like Amazon of today. Sometimes we just go out, look at pages, decide what we want, put it in a cart, let Sears know, or in this case Amazon, let Amazon know that we want it, and it's delivered to our house almost magically. Sears as a company should have been well positioned for eBusiness, but they had some problems. While they had a foundation that would have served them well, they didn't have the open mind and the innovation. As you're going through this course this semester, I want you to think of e-commerce from an innovative position. Now, you probably have heard the term, you need to think outside the box. Well, I kind of think that term is archaic. And in fact, if I say think outside the box, maybe I myself am not thinking outside the box. But I want you to think in innovative ways, have an open mind of what e-commerce can be, not just what it is today. Now, what it is today is a lot different than what it was 3 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and 30 years ago. Now, you may find it interesting that I mentioned 30 years ago, but the internet did exist 30 years ago. The internet actually existed much longer than that. But it was about 30 years ago that the World Wide Web became a thing. And that took the internet from a scientific, academic, and very dry format to something that actually made its ways into the hearts of the people of the world. With the World Wide Web, all of a sudden we could just click, just like we do today, to get from one page to another, to be able to find whatever we're looking for. That was new in the 1990s. And with that became the graphical web. Before the graphical web came around, there were no pictures on the internet. It was all just bland text. What you're looking at here is Mosaic, widely considered the first commercially available and the first viable web browser. Now, Mosaic was an academic project of the University of Illinois. The people who started Mosaic, some of them left academia and then started a commercial version, which you may have heard of, called Netscape. And then from there, we had what we called the browser wars, where it was Netscape against Internet Explorer. And for a long time, even though now Netscape is not to be seen or known and not used at all, but for a long time Netscape was winning out against Microsoft in the browser wars. If you look at this particular page that's in front of you, you should notice that it's still pretty bland looking, although there's some imagery on it and there's links. Very, very low color. In fact, I can remember in the 90s, the first time I saw a web page with a white background, I was just astounded because I had been living a life of watching the internet, and specifically the World Wide Web, a segment of the internet, just in grayscales. This is what Yahoo looked like at that time. Again, very, very plain. But Yahoo was the market leader in being able to easily find things on the internet. Much like we would now say that we go to Google to find things. At the time, Yahoo, even though it exists still today, but was definitely the market leader. It was the go-to place for getting information on the internet if you don't know the exact website to travel to. At that time, it was the Wild West of the internet and of managing how we were going to navigate it. Now, some people still say we're in the Wild West of the internet, but I say that the internet, in its current form at least, is maturing quite a bit. It's been around now for decades. Some of the brands you see on your screen here are brands that you probably have never even heard of. Some you may have heard of, but almost all of them are a shadow of what they were in the past. In fact, you'd have to say all of them are a shadow of what they were in the past. Like Yahoo, every name you see on the screen was a player, a fairly significant player, some at one level and some at others, but they were a fairly significant player in being able to find things on the internet. It wasn't like you just automatically went to Google or maybe sometime went to Bing. Instead, you may go to Inktomi, Excite, Infoseek, Lycos, LookSmart, AltaVista, Ask Jeeves. Now, throughout this semester, we'll be dabbling in search engine optimization. In today's market, people who are in that field of search engine optimization, optimizing sites for the best search results, really focus on just a couple search engines. Even though there's still hundreds that exist, the vast market share in the United States goes, of course, to Google, followed by Bing with a fraction of what Google has as their market share. Back in the 1990s and the early 2000s, but particularly in the 1990s, those of us who are in search engine optimization trying to get our sites to show up better in search results had to look at all these different companies because the market was highly fragmented and people were using all these different sites to find what they were looking for. So as marketers, we had a very fragmented job to do to figure out how we're going to show up high or optimized with each one of these players. Now let's start with some baseline definitions related to e-commerce. It's important that we have a shared definition of what it means. First of all, let's talk about the difference between e-commerce and e-business. I would say we're getting to a place where this distinction is not as substantial or as important as it used to be. In the past, I've always defined the difference between e-commerce and e-business as e-commerce is the type of thing where you see as more of a transaction. You go look for a product, you buy the product, and the product is shipped to you. Where e-business more broadly was this idea of anytime we used a digital mechanism to do the functions of business. Again, I would say that the differentiation between these two has started to disappear or at least meld together. But you should know as a general rule and as a shared definition going forward in this class that we're going to say e-commerce is more of the transactional type of purchase functions where e-business are the other things we do. So for instance, payroll. In most companies, payroll has an electronic or a digital component that makes it so you as an employee gets paid or you as an employer are able to pay your employees with a high degree of accuracy and fairly low cost compared to the way we used to pay employees 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Just think of this as e-business encompassing all the pieces of business that's done digitally, and e-commerce will generally say are those things that are transactional in nature, where a customer, maybe it's a business, maybe it's a consumer, but a customer is going out buying a product, committing that transaction, and then having that product delivered in one way or another. Maybe as a service, maybe as a digital delivery, or maybe as a physical delivery to their doorstep. Now, as part of the history of the internet, in the early days of the internet, it was popularized, and most of us all agreed, I was a big advocate for this, that when we talked about the internet, we talked about it with a capital I, because it was a proper noun. There was one internet. Now, millions of computers on the internet, millions of people, but there was one internet. Over the years, we as a society have generally decided that we're going to use a lowercase I, saying it's no longer a proper noun. It's this mechanism more than a proper noun defined. So whether you use the capital I or don't use the capital I, just know there's still some people who will say, oh, you've got it wrong, and here's the reason why. The key is when you're using one or the other, just know why you're using it that way. I would say the more popular, the more accepted way of writing the word internet, and you should know this as a e-commerce practitioner, is with a lowercase I. In fact, if you take a look at this tweet here from 2016, so we're talking almost 10 years ago, not quite, but almost, AP, the Associated Press, who is often seen as the authority about how we talk about things in commercial or business writing, certainly in journalism, they said, as of June 1st, 2016, the internet with an uppercase is now internet with a lowercase. When we think about the internet and how e-commerce and e-business come together, we need to know how e-business is often defined. One way that we'll define it is by the dimensions of e-commerce. And this chart starts to explain that a little bit. It essentially says that a business can be almost no e-commerce, what we call traditional commerce, and on the other end of the spectrum, pure e-commerce. And then there's all these pieces in between. And it's based on whether it's a physical agent doing the business. Is it a physical product or a digital product? So you think of a physical product, an automobile is going to be a physical product. A movie video is going to be what? Well, it could be a physical product, like a DVD, but less and less likely. More likely, it's going to be a digital product. Also, how is the process of the sale happen? Is it very, very digital in nature, or is it hands-on, person to person? So if you think of companies, your laundromat that you go to in your city, if you don't have your own washer and dryer, we'd probably call that traditional commerce. It is not likely, although it's getting more and more likely, that the individual washing machines and dryers within the laundromat are internet connected. Now we'll talk a little bit more about the Internet of Things in a few minutes, where we see things like wash machines, printers, automobiles that are connected to the internet. And so it is more and more likely that the laundromat that you always would say would be mostly a physical business are becoming less and less pure play physical businesses. Now think about what could be an example of a pure play digital business. Maybe Amazon Prime Video. Why? Well, because what you order is digital, and you're usually not working face-to-face with a person. You're using their digital mechanisms to order your movie and to stream them to your home. The delivery, all of those things come together to be almost completely digital. However, as with the idea of there's really no pure traditional commerce where there's not a digital component, even with the laundromat, they're probably, in very short order for the places where it don't exist now, going to be wash machines that are hooked to the internet. And they're telling the owners of the laundromat, and maybe the manufacturers of the wash machine, how well is the wash machine doing? When is it going to need some regular maintenance based on the way it's behaving? In the same way, there are really no pure digital players. Even though they may be digital because the product is digital, the delivery is digital, the process for filling the order is digital, but they still exist on physical computers, computing devices that we call web servers. They still exist on physical land, on physical networks that often have wires, very often copper or coaxial cable, or when they use light to deliver the data, through fiber optics. So this is more theoretical than maybe something you just want to hang your hat on completely, but you should understand that these dimensions, the physical agent versus the digital agent, the physical product versus digital product, the physical process versus digital process, shows you where an individual company or organization or maybe even brand shows up on this dimension of e-commerce matrix. Now, the internet and e-business operations can be defined somewhat on the availability of their specific operations. On the internet, which was built as a pretty open platform, in fact, it was built to be fail-safe. There were so many redundancies in the system, in part because of fear of maybe an attack by a foreign power or some other type of malicious activity. And we'll talk more in future weeks about how the internet was made open and redundant. But generally, when you put something on the internet, and you probably have heard this before, don't share your social security number via email. Don't share your driver's license and birth date on the internet. Why? Because inherently it's insecure. Now, we've built some layers on top of the internet to make it more secure, largely through encryption, but there's still problems. There's still bad players out there. Generally, when we publish something on the internet, we say that we're publishing it for the world. Now we can restrict access. An example of that would be MyMCC. MyMCC exists on the internet as an internal portal, but you can only get to it if you know how to get through the restrictions. That's through authentication, a username and password. That's one of the most common types of authentication that exists on the internet today, but it's becoming less and less common as we find that it becomes easily broken. It has some vulnerabilities. Well, what do we do now? Instead of having authentication through knowing something alone, like knowing a password and knowing a username, we now have gone to something that some people refer to as multi-factor authentication. Well, oftentimes we'll combine something someone knows, like a username and password, with something they have, like a phone. You've had that, right? Where you put in a username and password, and then your bank comes back to you and says, prove who you are. We're going to text you a code, or look at your authenticator and see what the code says that you have to enter here. Or maybe look at your app where we've said someone's trying to log into your Google account. Was that you? Then there is the intranet. And the intranet's usually for smaller groups. Oftentimes it does exist on the internet as well, but it's a more restricted group. Some people would call MyMCC actually an intranet because it is a pretty limited group. It's students and staff essentially, which includes faculty, administrators, and others who have a vested inside interest in the company. Now, a little bigger audience for that than that is something called an extranet, where we take people that are internal and then we connect them to other key partners. So Walmart, for instance, would have the essentially an intranet that's expanded to an extranet. It takes your internal audience, but then it adds extra audiences. The extra audiences could be like a vendor, okay, a supplier, a customer. So the availability of the things that are published are often one of the ways we define a certain type of e-commerce or e-business. Who is it available to? This is another way of looking at some of those terms. The internet is generally everyone. Then we sometimes restrict that to maybe just suppliers, customers, collaborators, those people we have a relationship with. And then in the center is what we call an intranet, which is the smallest group generally. And at each level, there's some way that people are restricted from getting this information unless they're authenticated. Again, keep in mind the regular authentication, username and password, is based just on something you know, but we found that to be a very vulnerable system, so we've added combining something you know with something you have. And I had mentioned phones, but another example of something you have could be your thumbprint or an iris scan, something that's unique to you. Because without your thumb, you can't get into the system when a thumbprint is used as another way of authenticating you into specific content. Another way we can define the web and define e-commerce is by its generation. You will often hear of things like Web 1.0, Web 2.0, Web 3.0, and we'll talk about the IoT, which we mentioned a little earlier, the Internet of Things. So there's a lot of ways that we talk about this, but if you think of 1.0, that was when companies said, I'm going to build a website, and they put something out that looks like this. This should be very familiar to you based on the image you saw earlier of the web browser. It's just a company saying, this is us. This is what we're about. Listen to us. Watch us. Absorb us. It was a one-way communication. Now you compare that to the other generations that we've defined of internet. And when we say internet, we can say internet and along with that e-commerce. So 1.0, Web 1.0 is this idea of just self-entertainment. You just sit there and you watch the entertainment come to you. It's one way. Then we decided that we were going to build an experience where people could tell others what they want. And that's where social media comes in. Largely, social media was this combination of someone telling you something and then you going out and publishing content. All of a sudden, you were publishers. And that was a really big deal when this first came about. Because for the history of the world, if you wanted to reach the masses, you needed major, major investments. You needed a radio transmitter, a television transmitter, a printing press so you could print a newspaper. Those were the people that were in power. So all of a sudden, when we said to people, now you can publish in Web 2.0, you kind of was like an owner of the printing press. It used to be that the power of communication was in very few hands. Now, some people will say we're going back in that direction, and some of the biggest money, biggest players have taken control over the internet, have taken control over speech. For instance, on social media, we have an expectation, some people do, that we as the keepers of the internet, whoever you say that is, whether it's social media companies, big search companies, tech companies like Amazon and Apple, of policing the internet. So when someone says something, there's not really a democratization of information. It's not everyone can go out and publish with authority. We're going to restrict. If you say crazy things, then someone may come along and say, you are no longer allowed on this platform. But it was very innovative a couple decades ago when we said we're going to allow people to start publishing their own stuff with a very little investment. Instead of having to go out and buy a television transmitter for $1 million or a printing press for $500,000, now all you needed was a computer and an internet connection. Now, Web 3.0 was this idea of self-creation and immersion, where there's this flow back and forth between you, or the consumer, and others. Okay. There was live conversation. There was creation. You're building things. Not just building straight content, but you're building creative content. Virtual reality. Augmented reality, this idea of putting a mechanism on your head or on your body and making you feel a certain way based on the animated and false environment that's been surrounding you. And you can make your own surroundings as well.